How's it going, Bobby?
Hey.
Thanks for joining and participating. Yeah, as usual, there's only a couple of us in here besides yourself, because I don't know, Fridays are easygoing, so people come in a little bit later. I can also retweet that we're already started and see if someone shows up. There was a question about something. I think I received it on, oh gosh, maybe on Monday from someone. That was kind of a good question that required kind of a meetup about it. So we could probably do that. But Bobby, you were requested by name to join. So everyone's eager to know what's coming up with ONote. And I used it, as I said, in a couple of one keynote for the microservices meetup from Axon IQ. And then I also used it for a podcast, the CTO.ai podcast. Unfortunately, the audio didn't get captured, so I'm going to have to re-record that. And that was nearly 2 hours, so I'm not looking forward to redoing 2 hours.
Oh, no.
I hate it when that happens.
That's the worst.
It's you get lulled into into a sense of security with Zooms usually being recorded by default, and this was OBS streaming to YouTube. And the audio connection for the YouTube channel was not connected the whole time. It sounded like we were doing the interview correctly over Zoom and everything else. And then I got a grim message about 10 minutes after we finished. I'm like, oh no. All that time. And it was actually, the sad thing, it was like one of the better kind of interviews. The guys were highly technical, so we're bantering back and forth really quickly, covering a lot of ground technically, using ONote, talking about event modeling, talking about CKRS, event sourcing, all of the things. And yeah, what a disappointment that that audio wasn't recording.
Yeah, that's rough. Ugh.
I'm just going to start recording things on this side. The only trick is the camera. It seems like there's so much video processing that your camera, unless you can deal with a slight delay, you can't do a lot of processing on the video to split it into multiple things on one computer. So I'm thinking just hooking up. I have a bunch of cameras. I have this webcam here that can be just a monitoring kind of thing for Zoom, but I also have a proper DSLR and a handy cam that can all be done for like proper recording, and just do it in parallel. And then like if someone makes a mistake like that, and they're like, yeah, no worries, have it all recorded here. Here's my version. Let's save a lot of headaches.
That's right.
So anyway, very disappointing yesterday, but anyway, we got the keynote done, which also uses, which was all about event modeling, which is great. So everyone that's going to that microservices meetup will find out about event modeling if they don't already know. They'll see ONote being used to do that, and like why we need the tooling around it to help guide some of the patterns and see the benefits. So they're all eagerly awaiting, because I always show them the generate code and export JSON. So like, oh, please, I want. So I think this is why people requested you for the meetup. So we'll see. We can cover a number of talks. Who was it? Was it Darren? Was it you that requested, or is it Stefan?
It's me, Stephen. Yeah.
Oh, Stephen, you requested something for today's meetup, right? You couldn't make it on Tuesday, is that right?
Yeah. I was definitely interested about managing schema changes. I got the Greg book, but I haven't looked at it yet.
Yeah, so we can cover the evolution of schema changes in event sourcing. I think it's a really interesting problem that arises in how accustomed we are to having a static representation of what business is. And from the OO UML way of thinking, here is our interpretation of what the system is right now. And in business, that's never static. If you're standing still in business, you're dead, right? At least in the private sector. And so really, what is the true value of not having migrations, versioning of schemas, as a centerpiece to how you design your systems. Why is it an afterthought? Why is in a traditional system with data migration the thing that kills you? I keep going back to this story from time and time again. I was working at a company where we had to backport features because once a customer was on a specific version of the software, it was so error prone to migrate their data to the new version of the software that it was easier to backport features to the previous version and just not upgrade them. Like you had to bit by bit see how the data underneath would play with those new features. But every time they tried to make a migration from version 3.6 to 3.8 or whatever, it was just a death march. It just never ended. There was just so many things that were shoved under the rug in terms of how the data was going to be stored. They had an upstream project that they had forked that was part of the core as well. So there was all of that. So it can get really bad, this stuff. Event sourcing at least has the idea that these are the events as we knew business to have happened. We have a better understanding. We'd like to use these other events instead. And so Greg's book obviously goes into this about many different ways of doing that. But in essence, it's at the time that you realize that there's a difference in your abstraction, you start recording new events and drop the old ones. But what do you do with the old ones? Well, at that point, the nice thing about event sourcing at least is that it forces you to immediately accept what those old events meant. If that means you have a null value for a field that's now introduced, or you split it to start to include a second event in a particular workflow to augment more information, make those change the read models. And I guess a big difference between traditional systems and event sourced systems like these CQRS is the multiple model piece. The part of the biggest problems with migrations later is that you're looking at a canonical model for all the data. So third normal form, you had one particular field that might have been used in a variety of workflows by maybe even shared by some entities. So if any change to that binding at that data level in that model had huge repercussions, and that's why it was hard. If you're doing CQRS and using multiple models for projections to see what state is from a certain viewpoint instead of a canonical model, you have smaller pieces to take care of. So if there's some piece of functionality you added for a specific view, you know that you'd have to just replay events for that one particular read model or view to get a new representation of what your functionality required. You didn't have to dissect the giant entity relationship diagram and to see how far that went, how far that rabbit hole went, not just by data integrity, but also by which pieces of code and which workflows and which entities also touched those things. And worse yet, obviously, if you have code level stuff on top of that shares that information. So that's just a brief kind of off the top of my head answer, but I think Bobby has also worked in a bunch of environments with not just legacy, but traditional and systems, and moved them to event-driven ones. And maybe you can have a second opinion from Bobby. I have to excuse myself for one moment. It's first day of school for my son. He just got back, and make sure he's got some sandwich in front of him. So please give me a moment and talk amongst yourselves, as Linda Richmond would say on the old SNL skits, for those of you old enough to know what that is. I'm gonna make Bobby, let's see here. Bobby's also going to be the co-host. Yeah, and Krzysztof is here, good. He will also be, oh my goodness, so a lot of people joining at the last moment. We already started, so they missed out. Okay, we have oh, hi, Nicole's here, great to see her again. Let's see who else. Andreas is back. Wonderful. Okay, so give me a moment. I'll be right back. Oh, Eurydice is here too. Great. So I will be back. Just gotta set my son up with some food, and I'll be back in 2 minutes. So same question, Bobby. Your turn.
Sure. Yeah. So my only two contributions to that are, I guess, three contributions. One is Rich Hickey's talk called Speculation. I dropped the link in the time tracking Slack. Super good talk. It talks about schema evolution. He goes after semantic versioning a little bit. So if you really love semantic versioning, you know, prepare to have your feelings hurt a little bit. But he talks about some of the mathy things that we can do around schema evolution with set regular expressions, et cetera, to kind of detect schema breakage, you know, in schema evolution. The second one that I'll mention is Martin Kleppmann's.
Bobby, could you repeat the previous question? Somebody asked in the chat, and I myself, I didn't know what was the question.
Oh yeah, the question was from Stephen around schema evolution, right? So inevitably things change, your event schemas change, your model schemas change, your read model or view schemas change, etc. So I'm just giving kind of the references that have shaped my thinking on this. One is Rich's talk, Speculation. The other is Martin Kleppmann's great article from 2012 on schema evolution. That's like technology specific, but it does address some of the philosophy around how schemas evolve over time. And then kind of the third bit that I'll share is around phased, so building your system. So the great thing about event modeling and event source systems is that you sort of have a different set of abstractions that change at different rates. So you can change your read model schemas, for example, frequently. And that's not a big deal because you just replay data or rebuild them or whatever. Like you can change your read model schemas all the time. Most systems are 90% read, 10% write. And so you can build all kinds of different views of the data for different data access patterns, different use cases, et cetera. And you can change those schemas all the time. So like the database level, you can tinker with that until you kind of get the right, most efficient, way of retrieving that data for a particular data access pattern. And you can change that very frequently, and that's fine. The UIs you can change all the time, right? You can change where things are located, how things feel, the look and feel of the UIs. You can change those rather frequently. The business events for any given business domain will change relatively rarely compared to other parts of your system that you can change. The business events should change relatively infrequently. Banking and maintaining a double entry ledger hasn't changed like fundamentally since like the 1400s, right? I mean, it's like a really old way of keeping data, and sure, we've added some fields and we keep track of new things in those ledgers, but at Capital One, I worked on old, fixed width, tab delimited files, where you've got, okay, these first 4 bytes mean this, and then the next 16 bytes mean this, and then go to this third field that's 8 bytes wide, and the first 3 bits mean this, and then if it's this value, you go to the 4th bit, and then anyway, so like we're doing that kind of stuff all the time to try to like cram new features. There was this memo field that was originally intended as kind of a free text, like, I don't know, write some notes about the field, but it got like abused to be every feature between 1985 and 2012. You had to abuse that memo field to stick in a few extra bits of data around real-time payments transfers or debit card origination or whatever. So there was like all this stuff that you had to stick into these fixed width files. But for the most part, that fixed width file worked from the 70s, until the present, right? Like you've got the set of business event, kind of attributes that just were pretty stable over time. So I guess the point of that is you can change your views and your materialized views frequently, but your business events should change relatively rarely. When they do change, there's 2 categories of change. And this gets to Rich Hickey's talk on speculation. There's changes that break me or changes that don't break me, right? And there's a whole category of changes that you can make. If you add a field, shouldn't break anyone, right? If you're getting more data than you expected, great. I've got extra keys on the map. I just don't happen to be using those keys, no problem. So that should never break you. Adding a key to a map should never break you. if you remove a key from that map, that's going to break everyone downstream, right? So if you're providing less data, or if you're requiring more data of your users, or providing less to them, then you've broken them in some fundamental way. So with events, you don't need to worry so much about requiring. It's just about, what data do these events provide? And so 90% of the category of changes that you would make to an event schema shouldn't break anything and should be fine for all downstream users. In the 10% of cases where you do have to break something, then you can, there's techniques. I think actually Greg writes about some of these techniques. Greg Young writes some of these techniques where you've got your event log, it's got all these events in it. You can create an entirely separate, a new event log, play events out of the first one, subject to some transform into event log number 2, and then eventually have your users cut over to start using event log number 2. The same way that you might evolve an API or something, right? It is a breaking change. It's gonna be painful for your consumers. Like, we just have to admit that. And you have to, figure out a nice coordinated way of migrating users from event log 1 over to event log 2, version 2.0. But this should be a relatively rare thing, right? We're talking once every couple of years, if that, this should not be a routine thing that you make your users do, because it's painful. So anyway, those are all of my thoughts on that subject.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Bunch of ideas on what you just said, but that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully it clarifies a few things. I'm not sure if what other specific things with your domain you want to dig into.
I think, and I won't take up a whole bunch of time on this, but the concept of that it shouldn't change a lot. Like, so there's a talk from someone from ThoughtWorks on data meshes, and she also was saying how, like, if you do proper DDE, your business doesn't change, your details of your implementation may. But in that talk, she also kind of talks about an insurance domain, and she's also saying that, well, if you have an app or a startup, like, that might be different, and the business will change a lot. And so that's where I feel like I'm rubbing against the grain a bit, where I'm like, well, yeah, but what if your 10% isn't 10%?
Yeah.
But nice just to know that it's the replay pattern, like, just knowing that is super helpful.
Yeah. I think you could look at it as a way of accounting. So in this meetup, we always keep kind of saying that accounting skills are a lot more helpful than programming skills when you're talking about information systems, because what you're doing is really keeping track of what your idea of business was. And like you said, it may be, it might vary quite a lot, especially in a startup, when, every month or every 2 months, you really are pivoting and you are using some of the same data, because you definitely don't want to redo things and interrupt your users too much and things like that. So you're reusing certain percentages of what your system was. And so it's really good to have an accounting-like mindset so that you have traceability as to where all the information came from. And event sourcing, I simply don't have a better way of managing information systems in a better way than what event sourcing provides. I think without that trail of breadcrumbs, you can get into a heaps of trouble, especially when you're moving from MVP to the alpha or beta stages of your startup. Those end up tanking companies sometimes. I always use an example of Picatic, one of the companies here, that went as fast as they could with MVP, with a traditional 3-layer cake of architecture. If you can squeeze some extra information to the single table you have, cut all those important corners to go fast. It can put you in a bind where you've promised future users something, but you can't deliver because you're really stuck at that death march stage of high complexity and no real way to audit as to how you got into certain situations, and adding these features that you promised for the beta version or the version 1 are just impossible. So that company almost got shut down. They were kind of on mothballs for 2 years, and then got an injection of new funds, and then took off, eventually getting bought out by Eventbrite. But had they actually cut the corners that weren't the architectural pillars, that weren't the accountability of data, they probably could have kept going. Maybe there would have been a blip, but certainly not 2 years. And the situation would have been reversed. They would have been buying Eventbrite instead, because the companies were pretty much the same size if you go back that far.
Yeah.
And so 2 years in a startup market is really important. And if you can have a way to go fast, and I posit that it's actually faster to go with event sourcing, because the only thing you need to do is write what happened down on a ledger and then worry about how you're going to view it later. I think it's much faster than the preconceived sort of notion that your framework is making tables for you. By making tables for you and making that canonical model, it's really pouring cement around your feet fast. But because it's fast, people like it. But it's the wrong mindset. It doesn't have that accountability built in. And so if you have these systems, like Bobby said, the fact that there's a whole bunch of read things that you can change quite, it's a low risk. And you also have a responsible way of changing the important things, which a lot of times will happen in a startup. But the key is responsible, and the fact that you have traceability built in by default.
And the traceability is exactly important. Like Adam said, the other really important thing is that event sourcing forces on your system this discipline of separating the things I write down, to just understand what's going on in the world, and then my current understanding of those things. And by making that separation, that's a CQRS separation, where you have your event source, you've got your events that you're writing down, and then you've got how I interpret those events. I still, even in a startup, I posit that how I interpret those events will change 10 times more frequently than the schema of the events themselves, right? What I'm writing down.
You might not even know why you're writing something down. I guess it's what we asked for, but it's there because they entered it. And then, oh, wow, look at the insight we can have. This is a new report we never thought we could have.
That's right.
Greg brings that up all the time. It's like, you don't know what will be useful to you a year from now.
Right. So just write it down. Just write it down. Yeah. Even if you don't have anything specific to do with it, if you know it's an important business outcome, write it down. You've got Tesla cars driving all over the world, writing everything down. Everything that all of their sensors see, they're just recording it. They don't have a use for even 10% of that data right now. Even all of the self-driving stuff barely scratches the surface of using all that sensor data, but they know that they're going to need it, so they're writing it down, right? The observations we make about reality, what our customers ask us to do, the decisions that we make internally, just write them down, because somebody at some point is going to need those things. And for a long time in the industry, there's been this artificial divide between analytics and transaction processing, right? That's an artificial divide. It was driven by the capabilities of RDBMS systems in the 90s, where we've got, OLTP stuff goes over here because it's efficient and it writes quickly in third normal form. And then OLAP stuff happens over here. You've got to dump the data overnight, ETL, and then you can do your analytics stuff because that blocks the data and we can't take any new transactions in, et cetera. That's artificial. And it's sort of nonsense at this point in IT world. But, there's been a lot of cement poured on that particular decision too, right? You've got whole career tracks now that are data science, analytics, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got, software engineering over here, and we're the ones that deal with the transaction processing concerns. It's the distinction is artificial, right? If we just build our systems out of the same exact raw materials that the data analysts need, well then, man, it makes our system really easy to analyze. And we can understand our customer's intent, and we don't have to have a whole separate system over here for customer analytics, and then we've got our transaction processing app over here.
You're absolutely correct. There's a whole industry on that translation layer that was created in those days, right? I don't have business activity monitoring. I have activity monitoring for how busy my CPU is. Yeah, well, that doesn't tell me anything. I want I want to know why certain tables change in relation to one another. Well, why don't you just start with those reasons instead?
Yeah. that was always
our tables be the projections of that for other purposes, right?
That was always our observation in banking too. It's like, by law, we're required to maintain these audit tables over here on the side so that the auditor can come in later and say, you learned some stuff about a loan applicant, and then you made a decision about the loan. If the stuff that you learned about that loan applicant includes their race or their zip code or, this handful of personal identifying information before you made the loan application decision, you're in violation of certain US banking law. And so we have to maintain these tables on the side. And so we have these whole bolt-on systems, pervading all of our APIs and our SDKs for building our API systems that were just for maintaining these audit data. And I kept making the point to anyone who would listen as loud as I could. Let's just build the systems out of audit logs. Let's just start with the audit log. The auditors can use that for their auditing stuff. The transaction processing, the software engineers can use it for the application concerns. The data scientists and the marketing people can use it for customer behavior and all that stuff that we're using third-party tools that we're paying a ton of money for. Like, why don't we just start there, start with those things? So coming all the way back around to Stephen's question is, the things, the fundamentals of our business, the interactions that we have with our customers, the decisions we make internally, the observations we make about the world, these things don't change very often. They do change, and when you're in a startup, so they certainly change more often than, if you're a 100-year-old insurance company. But much more frequently, you will be changing how you interpret those data, what digestions and projections from those data that you're making to do a particular analysis, right? The whole key to machine learning is that you have to have these sort of event level data in order to train these models. Machine learning model is just another read model. It's just another projection. Workflows, that's another thing. A lot of times in the past, we've conflated the data model and the workflow model and the events, and they're all kind of like tied up together. You've got like systems like JBPM and BPMN and BPEL and all these systems that complex and tie together the business model, the event model, and the workflow. And they're all tied together and they're inextricably linked, and you're basically maintaining a table, which is the current state of any given workflow. That's nonsense. When you have an event source system, the workflow, the state machine of, where am I in a particular process, you can change that frequently. You can change that state machine to your heart's content. And then you just play the events against that state machine to get different outcomes. You can even have 2 or 3 different versions of that state machine that represents, say, your customer life cycle. You can have 2 or 3 versions of that live in production running, and then you can A/B test among them and say, hey, which of these life cycles for this particular business process give us the best outcomes, and just choose, because you're just taking the events, which are stored discretely and separately, running them up against a state machine definition, which is some piece of code somewhere, and building a read model, right? The current state of this customer is just a read model. And so I can have 2 or 3 different read models in production, and I can just A/B test among them and say, hey, this one performs the best. When we track the customer this way, we have the best outcomes with our customers. Great, scrap the other 2 and just use that one. So workflow, you can change frequently. Other types of read models you can change frequently, because workflow is just a read model. But the fundamental sort of inputs to those read models will change relatively infrequently, even in a startup.
Great, thank you.
That was a lot of words.
They're good words, because they're, for once, from someone else in a better perspective than mine. So, especially from the banking side, which I know you have a ton of experience in, and it's a good domain to study as something that's fairly static compared to business-wise to others. Yet they do have new regulations from time to time. So, there's that whole range of how you deal with these schema changes, and it's good to see, someone that has that many years experience from that level of, a static industry that still needs to innovate and do that and have that perspective of where the schema changes are safer to do and things like that. But rounding it all up for Stephen, it's basically, the read side's much easier, but even sometimes, like Bobby said, you can have a brand new system where you can start to, funnel in a few users, a % or a certain select few guinea pigs that you want to experiment with slight variations. You can do that. It's quite interesting, especially when you're doing event model. You can do it deliberately, because you can show that at the end of this workflow, you're going to still maybe have the same events at the end that are still produced. They will have slightly different data, which will affect the reports. Maybe you're trying to find out if there's a better discount, or maybe a preferred rate, or you discount the interest rate by 0.01% for certain clients when something happens. You want to see how those clients react over the time of a year or something, right? So in investments or whatever. So you can do that and have them marked, but the rest of the system will still act as if nothing happened. But with this information completeness and an event model to show how all the events are tied together, where the schema changes happened and how they're isolated into one subsystem so that the other systems don't necessarily have to be impacted by that. But you do mark maybe those accounts that they are the special accounts where you're testing some way of promoting some rewards for people that hold their savings with your bank account or in your bank and things like that. So it's about being quite deliberate and having event sourcing is really about that accountability of having this idea that it doesn't matter if we're doing an experiment. This person was using that experimental way of doing things, and these are the events that got captured. Maybe there's a big problem with it. Maybe we have to roll back this promo. But what stays is the fact that because of this promo that was in effect for these few users, their state has been determined from these facts at those times, and that is your accountability level. In fact, there's no better way to do that, right? Than the opposite way of doing it is to have to reverse engineer why some tables have some entries. Imagine doing it without event sourcing. It would be a nightmare to go through all of the possible tables that could have been affected and figure out why certain data happen to be in a certain way. And so I think most of us have been around for a while in the industry. Legacy systems are that needle in a haystack problem of why is this thing not working, and looking at 5,000 line procedures to figure out where things went wrong and debugging. And I never want to go back to working that way. So we're kind of like Linux adoption on the server in the beginning stages. Once people realize how good it is here, they don't want to leave. So we have a gradual movement to event-driven, event-sourced systems that people are realizing are actually easier to deal with. It's just different. So people have the baby duck syndrome, and then they slowly move over to this. But once you're on this side, it's like in the Matrix taking the red pill. You don't want to go back in the pod. You want to keep working in this enlightened way where you have everything, all the evidence you need of how you got anywhere. You're not sitting there debugging code for days on end, trying to figure out why things aren't working. After, we just celebrated our 5-year anniversary of my company, and in that time, I don't think there's a single bug that cost us more than 4 hours for one person to find and fix. That's never happened to me before in my career. And that's why I don't want to go back to working any other way. This accountability in event sourcing is incredibly powerful. I'll take any, small mistakes like having streams that are too long and read models that take forever to populate because of whatever. I'll take those pain points over the guesswork at randomly changing a line of code in a 5,000 line procedure to see if I can somehow get rid of this nasty bug and wait days. And sometimes these things come back, there's circular references, and the same bug comes back 4 months down the road because it's just this circle of dependencies that you just keep tripping unknowingly because it's been so long since you dealt with the other related bug. Those are nightmare scenarios I never want to go back to. So that accountability side, the fact that they're, versioning of these things makes sense. Back to the original question from Stephen about versioning the schema.